There's a line that almost no one talks about, not because it doesn't exist, but because it's invisible. You don't see it drawn anywhere. No one points it out to you. And yet, if you've ever been close to someone who pulls away when things get real, you felt it. You've stood right in front of it, confused, wondering why everything seems to stop just short of becoming something deeper. It's that strange place where things feel meaningful, but never quite secure, where words are said, moments are shared, connection is felt, but something always holds back. And the truth is that something is not random. It's a line, a boundary they rarely, almost never cross. Not because they don't feel anything, but because crossing it changes everything for them. What makes this even more painful is that from the outside, it doesn't look like avoidance. It looks like almost love. It looks like late night conversations, small acts of care, moments where you feel chosen, only to be followed by distance that doesn't make sense. And so you start questioning yourself. Maybe you asked for too much. Maybe you moved too fast. Maybe you misread everything, but deep down, there's a quiet knowing that something real was there. It just never fully arrived. That's the effect of this line. It keeps things close enough to feel, but far enough to remain safe. Because for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, safety doesn't come from connection, it comes from control, from distance, from never fully stepping into something that could change them or make them vulnerable in ways they don't know how to handle. So they stay just before that line. They might care, they might think about you more than they admit, they might even miss you when you're not around, but they won't step beyond that point. Not easily, not accidentally, not unless something inside them shifts in a way that feels bigger than their fear, and that's where everything begins to change. Because when they do cross that line, it doesn't look loud or dramatic, it doesn't come with some grand declaration. It's subtle, quiet, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention, but emotionally, it's one of the biggest shifts they can make. It's the moment they stop protecting themselves the way they always have and start risking something real. You see, their comfort zone is silence. Not necessarily physical silence, but emotional silence. The kind where they don't have to explain what they feel. The kind where things can exist without being defined. It gives them space to stay in control, to keep things from becoming too intense. Because intensity feels dangerous. It feels like losing themselves. So they withdraw into that space whenever things start to feel too real. And if you've experienced that, you've probably noticed how quickly it happens. One moment they're present, engaged, almost open, and the next it's like a wall goes up that you can't get through. But when they start to want you, truly want you, that silence begins to break. Not all at once, not in a way that feels completely different overnight, but in small, meaningful ways. They start staying a little longer in conversations. They don't rush to escape emotional moments. They begin to respond instead of retreat, and that might sound like something small, something easy, but for them it's not. It's uncomfortable. It goes against everything they've learned to do to protect themselves, and yet they do it anyway. That's one of the first signs that they're approaching that line, because presence, real presence, is something they don't offer lightly. It requires them to sit with feelings they don't fully understand. It asks them to stay in moments where they would usually pull away, and most importantly, it forces them to be seen, not just in the version they're comfortable showing, but in the parts of themselves they usually keep hidden. And that's terrifying for them. Which brings you to the deeper layer of this line, emotional exposure. This is the part they guard the most. Not their time, not their attention, but their inner world. The thoughts they don't say out loud, the fears they don't admit, the feelings they don't fully understand themselves. They've learned over time that letting someone into that space comes with a cost. It means losing control. It means risking rejection. It means opening a door that's very hard to close once it's been opened, so they avoid it. They keep things surface level, even when the connection feels deeper underneath. And this is where things get confusing for you, because you can feel that depth. You can sense that there's more beneath what they're showing. You notice it in the way they look at you sometimes, in the way they remember small details, in the way they come back after pulling away, but they never fully let you in. They never cross that final step where everything becomes clear and undeniable, and it leaves you stuck in a space where you're constantly trying to understand something that isn't fully being expressed. But when they start to want you in a real, undeniable way, that's when this begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for you to feel it. They start revealing pieces of themselves they didn't before. Maybe it's something small, like sharing a thought they would usually keep to themselves. Maybe it's opening up about something personal, something that matters to them. Or maybe it's just the way they stay present when things get emotionally close instead of pulling away. Whatever it is, it feels different. It feels like a door opening, even if just slightly. And that's because crossing this line isn't about saying the perfect words or making big promises. It's about exposure. It's about allowing themselves to be seen without knowing how it will be received. It's about stepping into uncertainty instead of avoiding it. And for someone who has spent so much time protecting themselves, that's one of the hardest things they can do. But here's the part that matters the most: effort. Because feelings, no matter how real they are, don't change anything unless they're acted on. And this is where many people get stuck. They hold on to the idea that there must be something there because of how it feels, because of the moments they've shared, because of the connection they can't deny. But they ignore the one thing that actually defines whether that line has been crossed or not: consistent, intentional effort. Someone who is still standing behind that line will always find a way to hold back their effort, not because they don't care, but because effort creates attachment. It builds something real, and something real means something that can be lost. So they keep things minimal, just enough to keep the connection alive, but not enough to fully step into it. And this creates a cycle that feels impossible to break. You give more, hoping they'll meet you there, and they stay just out of reach, giving enough to keep you close, but never enough to make you feel secure. But when they cross that line, effort changes. It stops being something they resist and starts becoming something they choose. You don't have to question where you stand. You don't have to analyze every interaction. You don't have to wonder if you're asking for too much, because their actions begin to answer those questions for you. They show up, not perfectly, not without fear, but consistently enough for you to feel the difference. And that difference is undeniable. It's not just in what they do, but in how it feels. There's less confusion, less overthinking, less of that constant emotional push and pull. Instead, there's a sense of movement, a sense that things are actually going somewhere instead of staying stuck in the same cycle. And that only happens when they've crossed that line, when they've decided consciously or unconsciously that the connection is worth more than the safety of staying distant. Because at the end of the day, that's what this line represents. It's not about whether they like you or care about you or enjoy being around you. It's about whether they're willing to risk themselves for you, whether they're willing to step out of the patterns that have kept them safe for so long, whether they're willing to let something real happen, even if it scares them. And the truth is, most of the time they won't. Not because you're not enough, not because the connection isn't real, but because crossing that line requires something they're not ready to face within themselves. And no amount of waiting, understanding, or loving them harder can make that happen. But when they do cross it, you won't have to question it. You won't have to chase clarity or search for meaning in mixed signals. You'll feel it in their presence, in their effort, in the way they stop holding back the parts of themselves they used to protect so carefully. And that's the difference between almost and real, between connection and commitment, between someone who stays behind the line and someone who finally chooses to step across it. And once you've felt that difference, once you've experienced even a glimpse of what it's like when someone stops holding back, it becomes impossible to ignore when it's missing. Because now you know what it feels like when effort is real, when presence is intentional, when emotional distance is no longer their default response. And that awareness changes you. It makes you less willing to settle for confusion disguised as connection, but it also makes you question something deeper. What actually makes them cross that line in the first place? Because it's not random, it's not luck, And it's definitely not something you can force. One of the clearest shifts happens around something that used to define them, the need for space. You've probably heard it before, maybe more times than you can count. I just need some space. And every time they say it, it creates distance that feels bigger than the words themselves. Because it's not just about space, it's about retreat. It's about stepping away the moment things start to feel too close, too real, too emotionally demanding. That space becomes their way of regaining control, of calming the internal pressure that builds when connection deepens beyond what feels safe. But here's what changes when they start to truly want you. Space stops being an escape. It doesn't disappear completely, because that part of them doesn't vanish overnight, but the intention behind it shifts. Instead of using space to disconnect from you, they start using it to regulate themselves without losing you in the process. There's communication where there used to be silence, there's reassurance where there used to be confusion. You're no longer left wondering if their distance means they're pulling away for good. Because even when they step back, they stay emotionally connected in a way that feels consistent. And that's something they don't do unless the connection matters to them on a deeper level. Because staying emotionally connected while taking space requires awareness, it requires care. It means they're no longer just thinking about what they need to feel safe, but also about how their actions affect you. And that's a major shift. That's them stepping closer to that line and beginning to cross it. At the same time, something else starts to change beneath the surface: their emotional availability. Before, it probably felt like they were only partially there, like you were connecting with them, but only to a certain point. There was always a limit, always a boundary you couldn't move past, no matter how much time you spent together or how strong the connection felt. It's like they were present physically, sometimes even mentally, but emotionally, they were just out of reach. And that's because emotional availability isn't about how much time someone gives you, it's about how much of themselves they allow you to experience. For someone who avoids deep emotional exposure, being fully available feels overwhelming. It means being affected. It means being vulnerable to someone else's presence in a way that can't be easily controlled or reversed. So they stay guarded even when they don't realize they're doing it. But when they begin to cross that line, you feel the shift. It's in the way they respond to you, the way they listen, the way they engage in moments that used to make them uncomfortable. They don't shut down as quickly, they don't deflect as much. They start leaning into conversations instead of avoiding them, and most importantly, they allow themselves to be emotionally impacted by you, which is something they usually resist. This doesn't mean they suddenly become completely open or expressive. That's not how it works, but there's a noticeable difference in how present they are emotionally. You're no longer trying to pull them closer or guess what they're feeling. Instead, they meet you somewhere in the middle, and that alone tells you that something inside them has shifted. Because emotional availability is one of the hardest things for them to give, and they don't give it unless they're starting to want something real. And when that happens, it naturally leads to another undeniable shift: priority. This is where things become even clearer, because priority is something that can't be hidden behind words or excuses. It shows up in actions, in choices, in where they invest their time and energy. Before, you might have felt like you were important, but not essential, like they enjoyed being around you, but your presence wasn't something they actively made space for. Plans felt uncertain, time together felt inconsistent, and there was always this underlying sense that you were fitting into their life instead of being a meaningful part of it. That's what it looks like when someone hasn't crossed that line yet. They keep you at a distance where you're close enough to matter, but not close enough to disrupt their independence or routine. But when they do cross it, priority changes everything. You don't have to wonder where you stand, because they start making it clear through their actions. They find time for you, even when it's not convenient. They include you in their life instead of keeping you separate from it. You become someone they consider when making decisions, not just someone they engage with when it suits them. And this shift isn't forced. It doesn't feel like they're doing it out of obligation. It feels natural, intentional. like they want you there, like your presence adds something to their life that they don't want to lose. That's when you realize something important. When someone truly wants you, you don't have to fight for space in their life. You don't have to prove your worth or earn your place. They create that space for you because not having you there feels like a loss they're no longer willing to risk. And that naturally leads into one of the most defining changes of all: consistency. If you've ever been caught in the cycle of hot and cold behavior, you know how emotionally exhausting it can be. One moment everything feels right, they're present, engaged, maybe even affectionate in their own way, and just when you start to relax into that feeling, they pull back, they become distant, unavailable, and you're left trying to understand what changed. This inconsistency isn't random, it's the result of their internal conflict, the part of them that wants connection and the part of them that fears it. So they move closer, then pull away, they engage, then withdraw. And this cycle repeats over and over again, creating a pattern that feels impossible to stabilize. But consistency, real consistency, only happens when that conflict begins to settle, when the desire for connection starts to outweigh the fear of it. And that only happens when they cross that line. Because consistency requires emotional commitment. It means showing up even when it feels uncomfortable. It means staying present instead of disappearing when things get too real. It means allowing the connection to exist without constantly trying to control or limit it. So when they stop being hot and cold, when their behavior becomes steady instead of unpredictable, that's not a small change. That's a clear sign that something deeper has shifted inside them. You start to feel safe in a way you didn't before. Not because they've changed completely, but because their actions are no longer sending mixed signals. There's alignment between what they feel and how they behave. And that alignment creates a sense of emotional stability that was missing before. And finally, there's one more boundary they rarely cross unless they truly want you, the future. For someone who avoids emotional attachment, the future feels like a trap. It represents commitment, expectation, permanence, all the things that challenge their need for independence and control, so they avoid it. They stay focused on the present, keeping things undefined and open-ended so they don't have to confront what it means long term. You might have noticed this in subtle ways. Conversations that shift when they get too serious, plans that stay short term, a reluctance to define what the connection is or where it's going. It's not that they haven't thought about it, it's that they don't feel safe enough to say it out loud. But when they start to cross that line, the future begins to appear. Not necessarily in big, overwhelming declarations, but in small, meaningful ways. They start including you in their plans. They talk about things that haven't happened yet, and you're part of them. It's no longer just about what's happening now, but about what could happen next. And that's significant because thinking about the future with someone requires emotional investment. It means imagining a version of your life where they're still there and being okay with that idea. It means letting go of the need to keep everything temporary and controlled. So when they start doing that, when they allow you into their future, even in the smallest ways, that's not something to overlook. That's them stepping fully across that line. And when you look at all of these shifts together, the change in how they handle space, the increase in emotional availability, the way you become a priority, the consistency in their actions, and the way they begin to include you in their future, it becomes clear this isn't about guessing anymore. This isn't about analyzing mixed signals or trying to interpret behavior that keeps changing. Because when someone hasn't crossed that line, everything feels uncertain. But when they have, you feel the difference in every part of the connection. And for the first time, you're not standing there wondering what it all means, because it finally feels like something real. And when something finally starts to feel real, that's when a different kind of fear shows up. Not just in them, but in you too. Because after spending so much time in confusion, inconsistency, and emotional distance, stability can feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious. You start wondering if it's going to last, if it's going to disappear the same way everything else did before. But the truth is, when someone has actually crossed that line, the energy of the connection changes in a way that isn't built on temporary emotion anymore. It's built on risk. Because that's what this next shift is really about: emotional risk. For someone who has spent most of their life avoiding deep emotional exposure, taking a risk like this isn't small. It's not casual. It's not something they stumble into without realizing it. It goes against their instincts. Every part of them is wired to protect, to step back, to disconnect before things get too intense. So when they start leaning into something instead of pulling away from it, it means they're choosing to feel, even when it scares them. And you'll notice it not in what they say, but in what they allow. They allow moments to linger instead of cutting them short. They allow conversations to go deeper instead of redirecting them. They allow themselves to sit in emotional closeness without immediately trying to create distance. And most importantly, they allow themselves to care in a way that affects them. That's the real risk. Not just liking someone, but letting that feeling have an impact. Because once they cross that point, they can't pretend it doesn't matter anymore. They can't detach as easily. They can't go back to that place where everything felt controlled and distant. Now there's something real at stake, something that can hurt if it's lost. And that's exactly what they've been trying to avoid all along. But when they want you, truly want you, they start accepting that risk instead of running from it. And that's when another shift begins to happen, something that changes the entire dynamic: effort without fear. Before, effort probably felt inconsistent. Even when they tried, there was hesitation behind it. You could feel the resistance, the internal push and pull between wanting to show up and wanting to retreat. It's like every step forward came with a step back, as if they were constantly trying to balance connection with self-protection. And that made everything feel unstable, because you never knew if the effort you were seeing was something real or something temporary that would disappear the moment things got too close. But when they cross that line, something inside them settles. Effort stops feeling like a threat. It becomes something they give more freely, more naturally, not perfectly, not without moments of hesitation, but without that constant underlying fear that used to hold them back. They start doing things not because they feel like they have to, but because they want to. Because being connected to you no longer feels like something they need to escape from. And that changes everything. Because now you're not questioning their intentions anymore. You're not trying to figure out if they care or if they're just going through the motions. Their actions begin to feel aligned with their feelings in a way that's consistent and genuine. And that alignment creates something you haven't felt before with them: emotional clarity. You don't have to decode their behavior. You don't have to search for meaning in the spaces between what they say and what they do, because those spaces start to disappear. And when that happens, something else begins to open up: communication. For someone who avoids emotional closeness, communication is often where things break down, not because they don't have thoughts or feelings, but because expressing them feels overwhelming. It requires a level of vulnerability they're not comfortable with, so they keep things surface level. They deflect. They avoid conversations that feel too deep or too exposing, and that leaves you feeling disconnected, even when you're technically still talking. But when they start to cross that line, communication begins to change. They don't just talk to you, they start sharing with you. There's a difference. One is about maintaining connection at a safe distance. The other is about allowing someone into your inner world. And you'll feel that shift in the way they express themselves. They become more honest, more open, more willing to say things they would have kept to themselves before. They don't shut down as quickly when conversations become emotional. They don't disappear when something needs to be addressed. Instead, they stay, even when it's uncomfortable, even when they don't have all the answers, even when they're not sure how to fully explain what they're feeling. And that willingness to stay in those moments, that's what makes communication real. Because it's not about saying everything perfectly, it's about being present enough to try. And that level of presence leads into something even deeper: the end of detachment. Detachment has always been their safety net, the ability to disconnect emotionally when things get too intense, to step back, to create distance, to regain control. It's what allowed them to navigate relationships without feeling overwhelmed by them. But it also kept them from experiencing something real, because real connection requires presence. It requires staying emotionally engaged even when things aren't easy or predictable. And when they cross that line, detachment starts to lose its power. It doesn't disappear completely because it's still part of how they've learned to cope, but it stops being their default response. They don't automatically pull away the moment something feels too close. They don't shut down at the first sign of emotional intensity. Instead, they stay connected. They work through the discomfort instead of escaping it. And that's a huge shift because it means they're no longer prioritizing their need to avoid over their desire to connect. It means they're choosing you, not just in easy moments, but in the ones that challenge them. And that choice leads to one of the most significant transformations of all, the shift from control to surrender. Control has always been their way of feeling safe, controlling how much they give, how close they get, how much of themselves they reveal. It allowed them to manage the relationship in a way that didn't overwhelm them, but control also limits connection. It keeps things contained, predictable, safe, but not deep. And surrender, real emotional surrender, is the opposite of that. It's letting go of the need to manage every outcome. It's allowing the connection to exist without constantly trying to control how it affects them. It's trusting something they can't fully predict or contain. And for someone who avoids vulnerability, that's one of the hardest things they can do. But when they truly want you, they start doing it anyway. Not all at once, not without moments of hesitation, but enough for you to feel the difference. They stop holding back in the same way. They stop trying to keep everything at a safe distance. They allow themselves to be part of the connection instead of standing just outside of it. And that's when you realize something important. Crossing that line isn't about one big moment. It's not about a single action or a specific thing they say. It's about a series of shifts that all point in the same direction. From distance to presence, from fear to risk, from control to surrender. And when all of those shifts start happening together, it creates something that feels completely different from what you experienced before. Something that doesn't leave you questioning where you stand. Something that doesn't make you feel like you have to chase or prove your place in their life. Something that feels mutual. And that's how you know they've crossed that line. Not because they told you, but because everything about the way they show up feels different. And when something finally starts to feel mutual, that's when a deeper truth begins to surface, something you might not have fully realized before. Because for so long, you may have been focused on what they feel, what they think, what they're afraid of, trying to understand their patterns so you could make sense of the connection. But once they cross that line, the focus shifts, not because they suddenly become perfect, but because for the first time, you're no longer the only one carrying the emotional weight. And that's where something quietly powerful begins to happen. You start to feel that you matter, not in a vague, uncertain way. Not in a way that depends on reading between the lines or holding on to small moments, but in a way that feels consistent, grounded, and real. And for someone who avoids emotional closeness, making another person feel like they matter isn't something they do easily, because saying it or even showing it requires them to step fully into the connection. It means acknowledging that your presence has an impact on them, that losing you would affect them, that what you feel, what you need, what you experience is no longer something they can stay detached from. And that's why before they cross that line, this feeling is often missing. You might feel important in certain moments, valued in certain ways, but it never fully settles. There's always a part of you that questions it, that wonders if it's real or just temporary, that doubts whether you truly hold a meaningful place in their life. But when they begin to cross that line, that uncertainty starts to fade. You feel it in the way they respond to you, not just when things are easy, but when they're not. You feel it in the way they consider your emotions, not as something to avoid, but as something that matters. You feel it in the way they make space for you, not just when it's convenient, but because they want you there. And the most powerful part is they don't always have to say it because their actions start speaking in a way that words never fully could before. And that's when something even deeper begins to shift inside them. Their relationship with need. For someone who has spent so much time valuing independence and self reliance, the idea of needing someone can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. Need to them often feels like weakness, like dependence, like something that could take away their sense of control. So they avoid it. They convince themselves they don't need anyone, that they're fine on their own, that connection is something optional, something they can step into or out of without it affecting them too deeply. But the truth is, that's only true as long as they stay behind that line. Because once they cross it, something changes. They start to feel your absence. They start to notice the difference between having you in their life and not. And that awareness creates something they can't ignore anymore, a sense of need, not in a way that takes away from who they are, but in a way that adds to it, in a way that makes them realize that connection doesn't weaken them, it deepens them. And this is one of the most vulnerable places they can reach. Because now it's no longer just about wanting you when it feels good or convenient. It's about feeling your importance even when you're not there. And that's something they can't easily detach from. You'll notice it in small ways. The way they reach out, not because they have to, but because they feel the absence of connection. The way they stay engaged, even when it would be easier to pull away. The way they begin to rely on the connection emotionally, even if they don't fully admit it. And that shift from not needing to needing is one of the clearest signs that they've crossed that line. Because once someone allows themselves to need you, even in the smallest way, the connection becomes real in a way it wasn't before. And that reality brings everything back to something that can no longer be avoided: actions. Because at the end of the day, actions are what define everything, not intentions, not potential, not what could be or what might happen someday, but what is actually being done. And this is where everything becomes clear. Before, you might have held on to their words, the things they said in certain moments, the way they expressed themselves when they felt close, but those words didn't always match their behavior. There was a gap between what you felt and what you experienced consistently, and that gap is what kept you stuck. But when they cross that line, that gap starts to close. Their actions begin to align with their feelings in a way that feels steady and real. They don't just tell you they care, they show you. Not once, not occasionally, but in a way that becomes part of how they show up in your life. And this doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean they never struggle or never have moments of hesitation, but it means that their default is no longer avoidance, it's connection. It means that when something matters, they act on it instead of retreating from it. And that's when you stop questioning everything. Because actions don't leave room for confusion the way words do. They either show up or they don't. And when they do, consistently, intentionally, it creates something you might not have realized you were missing this entire time: reassurance, not the kind you have to ask for, not the kind you have to pull out of them, but the kind that exists naturally within the connection. Because when someone is truly present, truly engaged, truly invested, reassurance becomes part of how they show up. You don't have to wonder if they care, because their actions make it clear. You don't have to question your place in their life, because they make space for you in a way that feels undeniable. And for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, offering that kind of reassurance is not easy. It requires awareness, it requires empathy, it requires them to step outside of their own comfort zone and consider what you need to feel secure. And they don't do that unless the connection matters to them in a real, meaningful way. Because reassurance means they're no longer just protecting themselves. They're also protecting the connection. They're investing in it. They're nurturing it. And that leads to one of the most important realizations of all:
Emotional safety.
because everything up until this point, the distance, the inconsistency, the avoidance, it all comes back to one thing: not feeling safe. Not feeling safe to be vulnerable. Not feeling safe to be seen. Not feeling safe to let someone matter that much. So they stayed behind that line where everything felt controlled and manageable, but when they cross it, it means something has changed. They feel safe enough, with you, with themselves, with the connection to stop holding back in the same way. And you feel that safety too, in the way they stay instead of leaving, in the way they open up instead of shutting down, in the way they hold space for you instead of creating distance. And that safety doesn't just come from what they do, it comes from what they stop doing. They stop disappearing. They stop creating confusion. They stop making you feel like you're asking for too much just for wanting something real. And in that space, something new begins to grow. Something steady, something mutual, something that doesn't feel like you're constantly trying to hold it together on your own. And that's when you realize this isn't the same connection you were experiencing before. This isn't the version of them that stayed behind the line, giving you just enough to keep you there. This is something different, something real, because they didn't just come closer, they crossed the line they never cross. And in doing that, they didn't just change how they show up, they changed what the connection actually is.